I grew butternut squash every year for a decade and lost most of it to soft spots and rot before Thanksgiving, sometimes before October was even over. Amish farmers across Pennsylvania store the same squash for 6 to 7 months without losing a single one. One overlooked step I was skipping made all the difference. Why squash rots? Most gardeners assume squash rots in storage because something went wrong during the growing season. Bad weather, a disease, soil that wasn't right. The actual cause is almost always what happens in the 2 weeks immediately after harvest, a window most home gardeners skip entirely because nobody told them it existed. Squash skin at harvest is still biologically active, still thin in places, still vulnerable to the surface bacteria and fungi that cause rot to spread inward. Without a specific process to close and harden that skin before storage, the squash begins breaking down from the outside within weeks of being picked, regardless of how perfectly it was grown. The growing season has nothing to do with it once harvest happens, without the curing step that seals the fruit for long-term keeping. What if the rot started before storage? Let me ask you something. What if the squash sitting on your kitchen counter or in your basement isn't rotting because of how you stored it, but because of damage that was already happening before it ever came inside? Every nick from a harvest knife, every spot where the skin was scraped against the ground during the season, every place where a stem was snapped off too short rather than cut cleanly, is an open entry point for the bacteria and fungi that cause soft rot. By the time a dark spot appears on the outside of the squash, the decay has already been working inward from that damage point for days or weeks before it became visible. The curing window nobody talks about. The step Amish farmers across Ohio and Indiana have never skipped is curing, a 2-week period immediately after harvest where the squash sits in warm conditions before going anywhere near a storage room. Curing requires temperatures between 80 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, low humidity, and good airflow around every fruit for 10 to 14 days. During this window, the skin undergoes a hardening process where the outer cells toughen, minor surface scratches and nicks seal over, and the sugar content in the flesh concentrates and stabilizes for long keeping. A squash that has been properly cured develops a skin tough enough to resist the surface bacteria that rot an uncured squash within weeks, turning a fruit that would last 2 months in a basement into one that holds firm and flavorful through February. The 2-inch stem rule. Every squash that goes into Amish storage has a stem, and not just a stub. A clean 2-inch section of stem left on the fruit at harvest is the single most consistent habit across Amish squash storage traditions, documented in Pennsylvania Dutch farming records, going back to the 1800s. And the reason is direct. The stem end of a squash is where bacteria enter most easily once the fruit is separated from the vine, because the cut surface is exposed tissue rather than hardened skin. A long stem left on and allowed to dry during curing forms a sealed woody plug at the top of the fruit that closes off that entry point almost completely. A squash harvested with a broken or missing stem, or with less than an inch left on, begins softening at the crown within 2 to 3 weeks of storage, regardless of how well every other condition is managed. Most home gardeners twist squash free from the vine with their hands, which snaps the stem at the worst possible point directly where the seal needs to form, and then wonder why the top of every stored squash is the first place that goes soft. The fix requires nothing but a pair of pruning shears and the discipline to cut rather than pull every single time. The right location changes everything. Now here's what makes curing even more effective than the step alone. Pairing it with the correct storage location after the curing period ends, a location that most home gardeners never use because it doesn't seem obvious. Amish farms across Wisconsin and Pennsylvania have stored winter squash in barn lofts and above-ground pantry rooms since the 1700s, not in cool, damp root cellars or cold basement corners where most modern gardeners instinctively put them. The conditions that preserve squash long-term are the opposite of what most people assume. Squash needs temperatures between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, which is warmer than a typical basement in winter. It needs low humidity, around 50 to 60%, which is drier than a root cellar designed to keep root vegetables moist. And it needs airflow, which a stack of squash packed tightly in a box or piled in a corner never gets. A barn loft or a cool interior room above ground that stays around 55 degrees through winter matches these conditions naturally without any equipment or monitoring required. The single-layer storage method. The physical arrangement of squash in storage matters as much as the temperature and humidity conditions around it. And Amish storage practice across Ohio and Indiana has always followed one rule without exception: single layer, not touching. Each squash sits directly on a wooden shelf or a layer of cardboard, with several inches of space between it and the next fruit, stem side up, positioned so that airflow reaches all sides of every fruit simultaneously throughout the entire storage season. The reason this matters is direct. When soft rot begins in one squash, it generates moisture and microbial activity on its surface that spreads immediately to any fruit in contact with it, turning one soft spot into a chain reaction that can ruin an entire shelf within a week, even when the neighboring fruits were perfectly cured and stored. A single layer with space between fruits catches one rotting squash before it infects its neighbors, and the weekly inspection that Amish farmers conducted through every storage season meant a soft one was always removed before it reached the spreading point. Modern storage solutions, including mesh bags, crates, and wooden boxes, all allow fruit surfaces to touch and restrict airflow to the center of the pile, creating exactly the conditions that accelerate the rot most gardeners are trying to prevent, and making it impossible to spot a softening fruit until it has already spread to the ones beside it. Let me ask you something most people never consider. Where exactly are you storing your squash right now? And does that location actually match what squash needs to keep for 6 months? Most home gardeners put winter squash in one of two places. The first is the kitchen counter, or a shelf in the kitchen, where temperatures run 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit through winter, far too warm for long-term storage, causing the squash to continue ripening past its peak and softening within 4 to 6 weeks of harvest regardless of how well it was cured. The second is a basement, which feels like the logical cool storage space, but typically runs at 40 to 45 degrees in winter, colder than squash tolerates well, and at 70 to 80% humidity, far too damp for a fruit that needs dry conditions to resist surface rot. Both locations are wrong in opposite directions, and most gardeners move between the two over the years without ever landing on the 50 to 55 degree, low humidity, well-ventilated room that actually produces 6 to 7 month storage life. Amish households never debated this, because the barn loft was simply the established location, inherited from the previous generation, at exactly the temperature and airflow conditions winter squash needs, without anyone having to engineer those conditions deliberately. The weekly inspection habit. Curing and correct storage conditions reduce squash rot dramatically, but they don't eliminate it entirely, and Amish farm families across Lancaster County conducted a weekly inspection of every stored squash through the entire storage season as a standard part of winter farm management. The inspection is simple and takes less than 10 minutes for a full season's storage. Every fruit gets lifted, turned, and pressed gently at the blossom end and along the sides where soft rot typically starts. Any squash showing the beginning of a soft spot, even a small one the size of a thumbnail, gets removed from storage immediately and used within a day or two before the interior is affected. Leaving a softening squash in place while deciding what to do with it is the single most common mistake that turns one lost fruit into 6 or 8, because a squash showing surface rot is already releasing moisture and microbial activity that spreads to neighboring fruits within days even when they aren't touching. Amish storage traditions treated removal as immediate and non-negotiable, the same way a single bad apple in a barrel gets pulled the moment it's found. The fruit removed early in the softening process is still fully usable for cooking and is not wasted. A Penn State Extension post-harvest management study from 2018 found that weekly inspection and prompt removal of softening fruits extended average storage life of the remaining harvest by over 6 weeks compared to uninspected storage under identical temperature and humidity conditions. 7 months common. Let me ask you something. What if the ability to store squash reliably through February changed not just how you store one crop, but how you plan your entire garden from spring planting forward? A gardener who loses most of their squash to rot by October plants as much as they can in summer, hoping enough survives to matter, and still buys squash from the store through January and February. A gardener with reliable 7-month storage plants specifically for volume in late spring, knowing that every butternut and Hubbard they put in the ground in May is a vegetable they won't need to buy for the next 7 months. Amish farming families across Ohio and Indiana planned their entire winter food calendar around the storage crops that could hold for the full season. And winter squash was central to that plan precisely because it was the one vegetable that kept longest with the least infrastructure required. A properly stored Hubbard squash holds its flavor and texture through March. A butternut stored correctly in a 55-degree room is often sweeter in February than it was in October, because the starch continues converting to sugar slowly through the storage period in a way that a refrigerator stops immediately. The storage skill changes the squash from a fall crop that needs to be used quickly into a winter staple that feeds the household for months after the garden is completely dormant and buried under snow. The varieties that store longest. Not all winter squash stores equally well, and Amish farmers across Pennsylvania and Wisconsin have always selected storage varieties specifically, rather than growing whatever the seed catalog offered. Hubbard squash, in its blue and green forms, consistently stores the longest of any winter squash variety, regularly holding firm and flavorful for 6 to 8 months under proper conditions, with a skin so thick and hard at full cure that it resists surface bacteria better than any other type. Butternut is the second best keeper, typically holding 4 to 6 months in good conditions, and it has the advantage of a smaller size that makes it easy to inspect and use without the storage math that comes with a 20-pound Hubbard. Delicata squash, popular for its thin edible skin and sweet flesh, stores only 2 to 3 months and should be eaten first rather than left for deep winter use. Acorn squash stores poorly compared to all others, typically softening within 5 to 6 weeks of harvest even under ideal conditions, and is best treated as a fresh fall vegetable rather than a storage crop regardless of how well curing and storage conditions are managed. A University of Wisconsin post-harvest variety trial from 2019 measured storage life across 12 winter squash varieties under identical controlled conditions and found Hubbard varieties averaging 210 days before quality decline, compared to acorn squash, averaging only 45 days, a difference driven almost entirely by skin thickness and sugar composition at harvest rather than any storage management variable. 6 months of squash from one season's harvest, 0 soft spots, and a storage system that Amish farming families have used since the 1700s, without buying a single piece of temperature control equipment. Cure every squash for 2 weeks at 80 to 85 degrees immediately after harvest and before it goes anywhere near storage. Leave a full 2 inches of stem on every fruit and cut it clean, rather than snapping it off by hand. Store in a single layer with space between fruits in a 50 to 55 degree room, with good airflow off the floor. Inspect every fruit weekly, and pull anything soft the moment you find it, the same day, no exceptions. And plant the varieties that actually store long-term, rather than the ones that look good in the seed catalog but rot by October. That is the complete system, and not one part of it costs anything beyond a bag of seeds and a pair of pruning shears. So here's the question. How many squash did you lose to rot last season? Drop a comment below and let us know. And while you're there, pick your team. Team 7-month storage if you're setting up the curing window this fall, or team still losing squash if you haven't tried the full system yet. If this video finally explained why your squash never made it to winter, no matter how well you grew it, subscribe to the Amish Life for more forgotten methods, and share this with someone who grows a great garden every summer and still buys squash from the store in January.